The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. On today's episode, we are joined by Tucker Perkins. Tucker Perkins is the president and CEO of the Propane Education and Research Council. Perkins joined PERC in 2015 as Chief Business Development Officer and was promoted to Chief Operating Officer before the council named him President and CEO in 2018. A Virginia Tech graduate in civil engineering, Perkins earned his MBA from the University of Richmond. Perkins is a dynamic and relatable leader who has amplified Propane's voice in the national energy conversation as a frequent keynote speaker on energy-related topics. Tucker is also host of the podcast Path to Zero, in which he engages energy thought leaders in provocative discussions regarding energy and the environment in the path to zero carbon emissions. Now let's get into the episode with Tucker. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Well, Sandra, it's great to be back. John, nice to see you again. It's a quick week, and we got another great guest, so looking forward to it.
and I think we're back on track with our time zone difference as well. We've now gone to British summertime, so
5 hours.
The weather hasn't.
Fair enough.
Same here, John. Today we are joined by Tucker Perkins, President and CEO of the Propane Education and Research Council, and fellow podcaster as host of the Path to Zero podcast. Welcome, Tucker.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this talk.
Excuse me there. Okay, let's kick off. As President and CEO of the Propane Education and Research Council, can you tell us the role that propane can play in the path to zero or net zero carbon emissions? But can I just put a little bit in front? Can you just explain to some of our listeners, maybe not all, hopefully all of them, what propane is?
Yeah, that's always a good place to start, I think. So, it used to be, at least, and I tend to have a perspective from the North America, but I can also talk quite a bit about how propane is used around the world. And by the way, it's a really different story as we move from developed countries to developing countries, and it's a great story. But at least when I started in this business, almost all of the propane in the U.S. came from cleaning up crude oil. It's one of the lighter things when we find crude oil. Interesting, though, today, all of the shale revolution, the general massive growth of the natural gas industry, almost all of the propane in the United States and almost all that we export around the world is come from cleaning up natural gas. So when we drill a natural gas well, we don't just get natural gas, we get some water, we get some other hydrocarbons, but one of the heavier things in a natural gas well is propane. Also butane, ethane, a few other things. But in order to sell what we'll call natural gas into a burner, we generally remove the propane, remove the butane. Today we remove the ethane, and we use those for either petrochemical or other uses. The benefits of propane, I know you might talk later on about what's the difference, but really I tend to think of propane and natural gas being almost the same, and in a burner and the emissions look virtually the same. The benefit of propane is it's used well beyond natural gas means. Easy to store, easy to transport. As we talk about the environment, one of the benefits of propane is that we don't contain methane. So while unburned natural gas is a pretty bad greenhouse gas, unburned propane is actually very low reactive. And in fact, this morning, I've been working with our Department of Energy, the Building Technologies Office, as they really are exploring the use of more and more propane as a building refrigerant. Because if it were to leak, it generally is very unreactive in the environment. But that's where, propane comes from. The United States is the world's largest producer of propane by far. We're also the world's largest consumer. But in this day and age where we talk a lot about natural gas exports, we export about 14% of our natural gas supply on a day-over-day basis. Propane, we export 70% of the daily production. So and we have massive impacts really in every continent on the globe. Now, if you will, I'll answer your first question now.
Okay.
That's a long answer, but your first answer, So how does propane fit into this energy transformation? And by the way, you'll never hear me talk about it as a transition. I think transitions are smooth and easy, and you hardly notice, as you transition from to. But this is the transformation. We're seeing it in Germany today, I would argue, in that manufacturing is being lost, jobs are being lost, people are moving. Certainly, this is a transformation with both winners and losers. Propane occupies to a degree that same position as natural gas, much lower in carbon than almost all the other existing alternatives. In fact, we study thoroughly even the electric grid in the United States, and we make the case daily that in 39 states or so in America today, propane is cleaner than the electric grid because the electric grid consumes coal, oil, natural gas, a lot of things. They don't just use hydroelectric or nuclear or wind and solar. So the answer to your question is yes, using more propane, certainly in lieu of diesel fuel. Replace diesel fuel whenever you can. But in many cases, particularly those energy dense applications like heat when it's cold, hot water, you can use propane or natural gas and reduce your carbon emissions immediately.
Well, thank you for that. That really sets the scene nicely for what we're talking about, doesn't it?
So, Tucker, our exposure to propane, to be fair, is somewhat limited. So that's why I'm so looking forward to this session. But we deal in the agriculture sector, and you're probably well aware that, especially in Canada, where we're talking about a lot of grain and operations, they have to dry it. And so they're really dependent on propane. And I know when there was some issues with not getting propane across from rail, that created a significant problem. So I know it's a big topic and a concern or to agriculture sector. So I'm really looking forward to this. So here's my question to you. Can you discuss some of the initiatives or advancements in propane technology that are actually driving carbon reduction efforts? Can you share with us if there's anything such thing on that?
Yeah, I would say to you that we really focus in three key areas. And I love your comments around agriculture because, we have been a vital part of the agricultural community, almost always well beyond natural gas mains, always in an area where perhaps electric reliability is either low or perhaps adequate voltage doesn't even exist. So, we work every day. But now I would say we've been working for decades, and we're probably unique to most groups that you'll talk to because we're not going to sell propane. We're really here to see that propane is used properly, safely, and think about the technologies. Today, we're thinking about 20 years out. 20 years ago, we were highly focused on efficiency and durability in all of our applications. It had nothing to do, frankly, with thinking about greenhouse gases or emissions, but the net result of having a more efficient engine, if you would, is the fact that you transfer more energy to power and therefore you have cleaner emissions. Today, that is really coming to pay great benefits for us because everything we do now is still focused on efficiency, but we're thinking about durability. We have to maintain diesel like durability whenever we can, but our solutions are so much cleaner. So here's a great example. We've been working with Cummins Engine Company for almost 9 years now. First in just thinking about solutions, then prototype and demonstrations. Now for the last really 5 years, final design and product manufacturing of an engine that's arguably more powerful than any engine they've produced in the 6.7 liter size. Cuts particulate matter has gone to zero or essentially zero. NOx emissions are the lowest category can be 0.01 grams, the ultra low NOx category by anybody's standards. And yet we're still cut greenhouse gas emissions 25%. Typical example of kind of where we have been working to bring out solutions that are affordable, have great economics to the end user, but the benefit of all of that other work is that they're much cleaner and better for the environment. And I could walk you through, you can pick a market segment and I can walk you through where we're doing that. In the building environment, we're working a lot on CHP, micro CHP, propane fuel cells, a lot of power generation work. In our key market has been to go after diesel fuel. Diesel fuel is complex, it's expensive, it's difficult to store, And in applications where we can prevail, which for us is generally medium duty, heavy duty transportation, we offer immediate benefits, massive benefits to the environment, massive benefits to our health, the planet's health, meaning NOx, SOx, all those other criteria type pollutants, and yet massive benefits to the end user. In most cases, half the operating cost of a diesel engine. We're doing some big scale stuff. 10 years ago, I led the innovation effort around the world, and we were approached by shipping owners looking for a cleaner fuel. I always tell the story because I think it's a good reminder. I didn't see propane being a solution. I thought that solution would be LNG, perhaps methanol or ammonia. Fast forward to today, we have a couple hundred ships on the water and that many more changing their engines over to propane. So 20 years ago, we weren't doing massive scale projects. Today, I'm fascinated every day about not only the breadth of what we're doing, but sometimes the scale from small to massive engine projects.
Tucker, I want to convey to you that this is news and fascinating to me because I would have not known or appreciated the changes and how propane is being used going forward. So thank you for that.
And I find, David, it's almost uniquely American right now. As I said, I'll be in Ottawa in just a month or so sharing some of our stories. Because while we work for these solutions in America, actually, our Cummins engine is going to be widely accepted in Australia and South America. We are so aligned with what's going on in Canada. And then really now we're just starting to take a lot of these solutions into Europe. Frankly, Africa and parts of Asia are going to really benefit as they can start with some of these solutions. They might never even see the diesel version, right? We can start with them. And in another talk, we could talk about what we're doing for clean cooking as we migrate families from cooking with charcoal, dung, and move them to cooking with propane. The opportunity there, and very much in concert with the United Nations, we have the potential to save 4 million lives a year. 4 million lives a year by just moving them to cleaner cooking.
Well, I'll look forward to continue the questions because certainly based on what you're saying, seems like significant growth, which means infrastructure and growth of propane as well, supply. So that will be interesting to discuss.
Something we emphasize on this podcast is the importance of education. What are some common misconceptions about propane's environmental impact, and how do you address them in your educational efforts?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And coming from the guy who works for the Propane Education and Research Council, you would expect me to have, a straightforward response. And I think that is a key portion of what we're doing is not only trying to understand let's just talk first about end users. I mean, we actually could talk about a whole list of constituencies, but let's talk with end users. What do they believe and how would they use propane? Because education is critical. I would say the biggest misconception, and I find it every day, is that there is a myth out there that the only path to a clean climate is through electrification, that electrification is the answer. And I think I would say we didn't start by actually taking offense at that. I think we have been really open minded about this, and we'll talk about my Path to Zero podcast sometime. And, that's a forum not just to promote propane, that's a forum to promote clean energy and really understand the conversations. But as I read, I'm an avid reader, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. I mean, it's devour journals. And there's this constant mantra, which, by the way, may be changing today as we talk, but that the only path to a clean climate is through this narrow electrification path. And I think what we firmly believe is that that is not true, that the path to a clean climate is through a multitude of clean energies. And I hear a lot of people say, well, it's about all of the above approach. And I'm quick to say, I do not believe it is all of the above. I think there are certain technologies that are overwhelmingly the right choice in different situations. So I think the one myth we continually dispel is that the path to a clean climate is only through electrification. I don't believe that. And lastly, that fossil fuels are bad and must be eliminated. I don't believe fossil fuels are binary. I would argue to my death that coal, oil, and wood are fairly dirty when they burn. Electricity that's made from coal, oil, and wood is even dirtier, right? And so I think we have to really work to stratify fossil fuels into a spectrum of carbon. And by the way, we wouldn't be where we are without fossil fuels. I don't go down that path, but in terms of energy and affordability and changing lives. But the two myths I see that we are routinely fighting is that this narrow path of electrification is the only path to a clean climate. And secondly, that all fossil fuels are binary. They're all bad. And that's not remotely true. Lastly, and I'll let you ask the questions, I don't think anyone really understands the migration of, I'll just call it the energy industry for a moment, cleaning up their own past sins, right? Learning how to find methane leaks, learning how to be better citizens with water or land use. And then lastly, the migration to renewable fuels. I've been working on renewable fuels for our industry before we even really knew what they were. And now as I can sit to you, I'm totally confident that the promise of zero carbon or negative carbon propane is real, and we're living it every day. So long-winded answer to your question, but those two myths, and I think it really hampers this environmental movement. I always quote really Voltaire, who said the enemy of good is perfect. And I find so many people want to wait and wait and wait for this solution 10 years, 30 years out. That's when I'll wait. That's when I'll make a change to a cleaner climate. And as I'm quick to say, every time I go to LA, I want to just grab the mayor and say, look, I could clean your air tomorrow by eliminating diesel fuel and switching to propane and natural gas in your diesel transportation network. And so that's the myth that we're consistently working to dispel.
Yeah, and staying with that, Tucker, effectively to do that, you've got to collaborate with industry stakeholders and policymakers. So, how are you doing that? How are you promoting the adoption of propane as a clean energy solution? Who are you talking to, and how do you do this to get the word out?
And David, we're really changing, I think. So first off, I mean, just to be clear, the Propane Education and Research Council is an agricultural checkoff, like the dairy or avocado. Some people may think of that. And because of that, we are relatively hampered in how we talk to policymakers. We don't, and to us, it's lovely. To a degree, we can be, politically neutral, policy neutral, and we're working to develop solutions inside of that. But we do talk to policy. We certainly are in a position to educate. And so what we do first off is we're talking all the time with end users. What is it you want? And this whole migration through ESG over the last 4 or 5 years, it's really been eye-opening as we're trying to respond to what customers want. Interestingly enough, I think Tesla is finally seeing what all of us who have been innovating for years understand, is that it's pretty easy to get, the early adopters and maybe even, the innovators that think that's what, give or take 16% of the market. To move to the early majority, it's fundamentally difficult. So we talk to end users about what they want. Then we're working with manufacturing, Cummins, John Deere. I mean, I could just list General Motors, Ford, Toyota. Let me list names for the next 30 minutes about what fits in their product planning portfolio and what do they see as transformational for their business. And then lastly, we're deep into it with universities and government. I mean, we work closely with Department of Energy. I'm actually getting given a talk next week to the industry, and we're probably involved in 40 or 50 universities right now, doing research across renewable fuels, agricultural, clean food, all kinds of things. And we really find universities are also really helpful for identifying problems and then looking to provide solutions to those problems. It's a difficult task. And I would say, and again, it's interesting as we talk, we have a Brit, Canadians, I'm American. If we had Africans, it'd be, the point of view is so widely varying depending on where you are on the spectrum right now. Frankly, I find, Europe is quite a bit ahead of us in some of the conversations. And I think we're ahead of Europe in some of the solutions right now. So it's a very different spectrum depending on where you are and how you use fuel and how you need fuel. But we're all moving in the right direction. And I love the conversation today. I mean, I'm seeing we've been working on hybrids for a decade. It's just in the last year we've found some success there. But I look at, Chairman Toyota of the Toyota Motor Company, who's been just a staunch advocate of hybrids. And now we're working with hybrid solutions in buildings, in transportation, in power generation. I mean, we're working across all of the segments. And I do believe in 10 years, those will be the solutions that we're choosing.
Thank you for that. It's my turn to ask a question, but I want to slip another question in here. And I don't think it's a tough one, but I was listening to this and it did strike me. Here in the UK, propane is not a big player in the energy mix and everything else. And you were talking about how, 70% of the propane you produce is exported. And I was just wondering, we've talked a bit about it. What's the delivery infrastructure that's required in propane? I mean, I'm used to seeing propane in containers or in small tanks and thinking it as a sort of bulk delivery fuel. Is that how it is?
I always like it when people at least think of that, because if we were in Brazil, they think of it only in small containers,
Yeah.
useful for home cooking or perhaps hot water. And so I think that is one. You asked the first question you asked, how do we differ from natural gas, or how do we relate? And I think that is the benefit of propane. So easy to store as a liquid, stored at relatively low pressure and easily transported. So transported by
Right.
pipe, like natural gas, transported by truck and rail, transported in relatively simple steel containers. And so that's the beauty. In fact, let's just go to it. If I was given the task to work with Africa to develop infrastructure, I would think about exclusively using propane, because we can take it inland by mule if we need to. We can bring it into the coast by ship, and then certainly we can do everything in between. So it is that ease of infrastructure, which, let me define ease. Ease means relatively simple steel, fairly low pressures, translates to fairly inexpensive, can move by truck, rail, bicycle, horse. So, and we see it every day, transported in all those ways. And so that is the true benefit. And that's why, to a degree, it's the useful fuel beyond the natural gas means.
I'm glad I asked that question because that does clarify a significant difference between natural gas and propane, doesn't it? And I like your definition of what's easy in infrastructure, because if alternatively we're talking about some other energy delivery systems, the infrastructure is not simple and quite critical.
Yeah,
Okay,
so John, let me just jump in with you there, because I find hydrogen is kind of the
uh,
fuel of the
I was
day,
nearly
if you
going to
would.
mention hydrogen. Yeah,
Yeah, and for us, and by the way, we're in a fascinating project in the tip of Chile, as we take abundant sunshine, mix it with carbon, and we create truly an e-fuel, and we can create gasoline. There we elect to create ELG, they would tend to call it there. So an e-fuel that's now, because we're thousands of miles from the users. So how do you get a molecule like hydrogen transported thousands of miles? You really don't, and you can't really do it cost effectively. But we can turn it into propane, renewable propane in this case, where we can then easily transport it thousands of miles and use it. So that's that's a great idea of the transformation, even in the fuel itself. But look, 5 years ago, I was probably the only engineer we had on staff. Today, we have three PhDs, and we just work on these competing systems quite a bit, trying to understand. And hydrogen still remains an enigma to me. I understand the technical benefits, but when you think about the practical limitations, its likelihood to want to leak just such a small molecule, the pressures that we operate, its limits of flammability being so broad, it's going to be a really difficult fuel to commercialize.
Yeah.
And so that's when we love talking about infrastructure, because for us, it's even a competitive advantage over natural gas, particularly in vehicle systems.
Yeah, that is interesting. I was going to say talk about hydrogen. I thought, will I, won't I? But I think you've now nailed it there, because you said one of the big myths is electrification. We see an awful lot of people saying, but hydrogen is the solution. And as you say, it's quite enigmatic. What color hydrogen is it? How do you get it there? What do you do? Okay, the proper question I'm going to ask you now is, looking ahead, what opportunities do you see for further integrating propane into carbon reduction strategies in various sectors?
And we're focused really in two areas: going after diesel fuel in transportation, period. It can be, and we don't really see that as a light duty fuel. I mean, I do tend to think, light duty vehicles, what you and I drive to the store or to church, one day might be a hybrid, might be a plug in, whatever. But we really work with medium duty, heavy duty. And there we can, as I said, we can cut NOx emissions 97, 98%. That's good for our health. By the way, I don't think we talk enough about health. We talk about the planet's health. We don't talk enough about human health at all. We can cut particulate matter almost to zero. We can't measure it. We know it's probably something there, but it's just not measurable. So we're going to call it near zero. And we can cut greenhouse gas emissions, depending on the technology, 15 to 30%. Massive benefits, right? And so we're just stay focused on transportation, on road and off road. A massive movement today for us is cleaning up the ports. We've been shocked at the amount of diesel fuel consumed in a port, and the opportunity to replace that immediately, clear the airs, quiet the streets, better for the operators, better for the people who live near the ports, massively. The other big opportunity, and I would have said 5 years ago we were still understanding this, but today it's now here, is in power generation. And that power generator, we've always been the backup fuel of choice for the residential homeowner, right? Everyone, at least around here, would have a Generac or a Kohler standby generator that's fueled on propane or natural gas. It's kind of a standard thing. Today, we're working on everything from residential scale prime power to utility scale microgrids. And where we're seeing right now is a resurgence in interest in power generation. And it's a new kind of power generation, right? Where, let's just go to a lot of companies you talk about in your day-to-day work, commercial companies who want to have reliable power, they want it to be affordable. And now what we're seeing, a lot of them moving to a hybrid system where on any one day they're making the math decisions. Today, am I a receiver of the utilities power? Am I a net generator for my own use, or am I in fact a generator to sell back to the grid? And we're seeing those systems more and more scale down. So that in our research work, we're working with quite a few residential focused companies that will be doing that work at the residential scale. So this whole issue around power generation, particularly in the US, driven by really the fragility of the grid, the clear, I'm going to say, indication that the grid is going to become more and more stressed. We keep taking off coal. I see today in my reading, Germany will have removed 4.2, I think, gigawatts of coal-fired power in the next 6 months. Pretty hard to replace 4.2 gigawatts of energy, right? And so what we're seeing that play out in the US. So companies are looking for new ways to maintain power, maybe be in control of their own power. And in many of those decentralized solutions, propane will be one of their choices.
Great episode, Tucker, on the role of propane in carbon reduction. To end this episode off, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think for me, really, the big takeaway is one, let's act today. I hope you'll let me have two takeaways. So I think acting today is certainly better than acting 2 decades from today if you're really interested in doing right for the environment. So one, let's not wait until perfect. Let's move forward today with good. But I think the other takeaway is that those people who are thinking about solutions, let me just take a broader gas solutions, natural gas or propane. with the advent of renewable natural gas, renewable propane, companies can make the decision today and use conventional propane. 15 years from now, they might use all renewable propane. And somewhere between now and year 15, they'll use blends of the two. But I think consumers can consider propane solutions today, knowing they're good for the environment today. And our work shows that as we introduce more and more renewable propane into the system, they'll always be superior environmental solutions. They also, by the way, are superior economic solutions that provide the operating characteristics they're looking for. But my two takeaways would always be act now, because acting now is way better than acting in 2 decades. And lastly, the promise of renewable fuels makes the choice of using propane or natural gas, for that matter, a real choice today.
Thanks for that, Tucker. John, what's your biggest takeaway?
Well, I've found this illuminating because I'm a long-term energy professional, and I think the number of occasions I've dealt with propane have been minimal. So it's been really interesting to hear this. But I think my takeaway is we so often, when we're talking about carbon reduction, transformation, transition, whatever, we're very often talking about it with a first world view. And I think what you've said about the role that propane can play in developing countries, and in particular, with something as simple as safer cooking and improving people's health, to me, that is a takeaway. We don't need the same solutions for all countries. And clearly, for some countries, propane is an immediate solution to a lot of problems now, regardless of climate change.
Dave, what's your biggest takeaway?
The takeaway that I want to tell our audience is you got to listen to episode 2, because the amount of questions that will pop up based on episode 1 is unbelievable, what Tucker said. But I thought what John said and Tucker conveyed, quite frankly, we really don't talk or evaluate propane that frequently. As I conveyed also earlier, that it's certainly rural and agriculture-based solutions. And by the way, you're right, Tucker, the whole demand for electricity and that customers are going to have to start looking at a hybrid system. And so I never considered or thought about propane as being utilized for that purpose. So thank you for bringing that to my attention, because that's certainly something we're going to have to look at and start evaluating when we're talking to clients. And wasn't thought of that way. So I can't wait for episode 2, because I can't wait to ask questions about the market potential and pricing and stuff like that. So I really enjoyed this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave, John, and Tucker, for a great episode.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.